Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Glad to be back now. We didn't have a real big break. Uh, Came back a little earlier than I expected. Thought it'd take 2 or 3 weeks, but I was able to get what I needed in just a short time. We're going to go on. We finished up with studying about hope a couple of weeks ago, and now we are going into the book of Daniel. Now that's a little different kind of book than we have studied before. You're going to find a lot of things there that are symbolic, a lot of things that are questionable, or not necessarily questionable, but debatable. So a lot of the theologians have debated it back and forth. So a lot of it I'm going to just give out to you, and you're going to have to make up your mind for yourself as you dig into it, because I am not going to tell you what to believe or what not to believe. So we'll just see what God says as we go through this. Now the book of Daniel, interesting enough, is the only apocalyptic book in the whole Old Testament. We have all kinds of books in the Old Testament, poems and prophets and things like that, but this is the only book that it's apocalyptic. Now the word apocalyptic, incidentally, if you're wondering what that means, I know I did. I had to look it up sometime for time to time. The word apocalyptic comes from a Greek word apocalypse, and it means revolution, not revolution, revelation. Bear with me today, will you? It means revelation or uncovering. Finding something that's hidden. And what Daniel is the book of Revelation for the Old Testament. Now, a lot of people say, well, boy, I don't know if I can understand, I don't really want to read Revelation because it's too scary, or I don't think I can understand the book of Revelation. Well, we're reading book of Daniel now, and that's the same thing as the book of Revelation. In fact, you're going to see as we go through it how the two of them combine in a lot of areas. And how Daniel was actually prophesying things that the book of Revelation picks up and carries on forward. So we'll get into that as we go along. Now, we know more about Daniel, the man, than we do any of the other prophets. As the Bible tells us a lot about the different prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah and all those prophets, but it doesn't really tell us much about the man. They tell us what they said, what happened to him, but not the man. Here in Daniel, this is going to tell us about the man Daniel. Daniel wrote this himself, and he gives us a personal account of his life from the time he was carried into captivity in Babylon in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, which was around 605 BC, until the third year of King Cyrus, which is around 536 BC. He's going to tell us almost step by step what happened to him and what his life was like during that period, the period of time. Daniel's life and ministry spans the entire 70 years of Israel's exile. See, at the beginning of the book, Daniel is a young boy, most likely mid-teens. That was when he was taken into captivity at Babylon. And at the end of the book of Daniel, he's an old man, around 90 years old. So you see that it covers an awful long time there. At verse 10, at verse 11. We see God's own appraisal of what, let me stop just a minute. In verse 10, chapter 10, verse 11. See, there you go again. I still have those trouble with chapters and verses. I'll learn the difference between them one of these days. But in chapter 10, verse 11, we see God's own appraisal of Daniel. This is what God says about Daniel himself. He says, Daniel, you are highly esteemed. Boy, wouldn't it be great to have God say that about you? Well, he can, and he should. Daniel was highly esteemed in the eyes of God. And you can also be highly esteemed in the eyes of God. Now, the book of Daniel is not about Daniel, even though I just got through saying he tells us all about his life, but it's really not about Daniel. It's not in the area, not in the sense that Abraham, Moses, and Joshua were written about, but Daniel was really God's vessel. Daniel was used by God. It was a tool in the hands, in God's hands, to accomplish His eternal purpose here on earth. Now, although there is historical and moral content and tone in this book, Daniel is primarily a book of prophecy. As we've seen, Jesus himself, even if you over in Mark 13:14, Jesus himself referred to Daniel as the prophet. So Jesus even remembered him and talked about him. In the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of Moses, is which the Torah came from, in the Pentateuch and other historical books, God's sovereignty appears as the backdrop. It gives an assumption about the God of the universe. But in Daniel, it becomes the central theme, a message to be shouted to God's people, Israel, and to the pagan nations surrounding them. The message to be shouted is, there is a God, and He's in charge of the world. Now, isn't that a good message? Yeah. Well, we're going to explore the sovereignty of God God in greater theological depth in this book as we go along. But right now, for here, let's just define it, the sovereignty of God, as very simply, God knows what He's doing, and He's doing it. Okay? Now, the book of Daniel centers on this sovereignty of God. And Daniel writes at the time when Israel had every reason to think that the old promises had been broken. Now, they knew that God had made them all these different promises when He brought them into the promised land, and God had been with them, and He'd promised them all the land. He promised to be with them and to take care of them and everything. But it seems like things had fallen apart, kind of like things are today, right? We know that God promises us victory, but as we look around us, we don't see that. Not much in a daily life today. But Daniel writes in a time when they had a reason to think that God had broken His promises, maybe, and all the old covenants had been shattered. They felt. See, paganism triumphed twice during this period. When the Assyrians took over Jerusalem, overcame it, and when the Babylonians came over and took over. And when this happened, the cause of the Jews was clearly lost. So Daniel offers this book in 2 languages to offset that. Chapters 1, 8 through 12 he wrote in Hebrew. Okay. Then chapters 2 through 7 he wrote in Aramaic. Now the key question might be, why would he write in 2 languages? Why wouldn't, if he was fluent in Hebrew, why not write the whole thing in Hebrew? Or if he's fluent in Aramaic, write it in Aramaic. If he's fluent in German, write it in German. Whatever you're fluent in, why not write the whole thing that way? Well, actually the answer is more simple than one might imagine or might think. See, in Daniel, the Hebrew section, portion of it that he wrote in Hebrews, deals with concerns that are unique to God's people, to the Jews, the people of the Old Covenant. So he wrote that in Hebrew because that was their basic language. That was what they spoke and what they used, their language. It was the Old Covenant Jews. Now the Aramaic chapters deal with the matters that are related to the wider populations of the Babylonians and the Persian empires, to the pagans, to the ones that were not, to the Gentiles, those that were not Jews, those who are not a part of the covenant of the Jews. And so he wrote that in Aramaic because that was their language, and he wanted them to see it, to hear it, and to understand it. Now, we ought to also remember, too, that though the Jews of the early Old Testament spoke Hebrew, by the time Jesus came along, they were all speaking Aramaic. Even Jesus was speaking Aramaic. Now, let's think about what the area we're talking about. We're talking about Babylon here. Now, let's look at some of the background. See, Babylon is a very, very important piece of land, or geography, for our study, not just in here, but throughout the history. See, when Noah and his three sons and their wives came out of the ark, it's going back a long ways, they began to multiply and migrate. Now Noah's son Ham bore a son named Cush. Now Cush bore a son named Nimrod. Oh, what a name. Who settled in the flat, fertile plain between the Tigris and Euphrates River in the area that was called the land of Shinar. It was later called Mesopotamia or Chaldea. Now, that's also called the cradle of civilization, because that's where things seem to happen. It come together after the flood. Now, it's the same area they think where the Garden of Eden was located. There's no proof of that, but this is what they think. Now, Nimrod, that name just makes me want to laugh. Nimrod established a great kingdom. The Bible says that kingdom began with the cities of Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. He's even credited with establishing several great cities in Assyria. Now, if you look at your map that I sent you, you'll be able to locate this. He was astute, powerful, and wicked. His city of Babylon is mentioned more than 300 times in the Bible. And because of all the evil in Babylon, some of the Bible experts have just started referring to it as the city of Satan, as opposed to the city of God, which was Jerusalem. See? Now, Nimrod built several towers in that area. The most famous one, you all know about it, it's called the Tower of Babel. You're right. Tower of Babel. And that was built in Babylon, or on the area of Babylon. He made he made Babylon and the towers the focus of his rebellion against God. Now, he welcomed pagan religions. He really liked those pagan religions, and he catered to the occult. Nimrod was really a Nimrod. Right? He promoted sexual gratification and prostitution in the worship of these gods, and he merged his cities and states into states, and he put them all under his control, and he took over the education system. Sound familiar? Because of the religious harlotry, which was the unfaithful practices, he began in Babylon. The city is called the mother of harlots. And because of the love for big government, he began at Babylon. The city is recognized for all the big government that he began in Babylon. The city is recognized for the beginning of world government. Now, David, the King David, if you remember him, I'm sure you do, King David, the fourth son of Jacob, was a member of the tribe of Judah, and he united the entire Israeli kingdom. He brought a union that stayed in place during the reign of Solomon. his son. Remember King Solomon. And Solomon would have been a great leader had he not, if it hadn't been for women. He had a like for women, and he had a lot of wives, a lot of concubines, and he put up altars for to worship their gods, and our God, Jehovah, just didn't like that. So, but he had made a promise to Solomon, and Solomon saw it went all through his kingdom, or his reign. But after Solomon's reign finished, the nation split. It split into two parts. It's commonly called the northern kingdom, which is Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was Judah. And you'll see that on your maps. Now, the southern kingdom, Judah, was approximately half the size of the northern kingdom. And it also held approximately half the population, about 300,000. And its capital city was Jerusalem. Now, Daniel was a Hebrew and a member of the royal family of Judah. So he was not just a commoner. He was not a Hebrew. He was a member of the royal family. So he was a pretty astute person. See, we don't know the exact place or year of his birth, but he was probably born in Jerusalem. We can pretty well figure that. And he was born around the year of 620 B.C., somewhere along in there. And he was about 13 or 14 years old when King Nebuchadnezzar captured him at Jerusalem. When he captured him at Jerusalem, a city, of course, in Judea, right along with the other Israelites, all the people of Israel and Judah that they captured and took into captivity. And he carried them off to Babylon. Now, this was around, 605 B.C. And even though Daniel was already well educated, he was selected for additional training, and probably because he was well educated. He was a smart man, and they wanted a smart young man, and they wanted people who were the wise men, the smartest people working in their government, in the government of Babylon. And so Daniel was already well educated, and so he was selected for this additional training in the languages and literature of Babylon. They changed his name. His name Daniel, which means God is my judge, was changed to Belshazzar. Now, don't get that mixed up with a king that we're coming along with later on in a few chapters, Belshazzar. Belshazzar doesn't have the T. Belteshazzar, which is Daniel's name, has the T. And the way I like to look at it, and helps me to remember, is that Belt, the T is a cross. So Daniel was the man that had the cross in the middle. Okay, so that makes him Belteshazzar. Okay, his name was changed to Belteshazzar, which means Bel or Baal, the god Baal, or keeper of the treasures of the prince of Baal. And those were all things that was the name that was given homage, you might say, to the god Baal, to Baal. Now, Daniel very quickly distinguished himself because of his determination to be faithful to God. No other reason but for that reason. He gained the blessings of God, and he reaped confidence and favor for all those around him. It's kind of like Joseph. Remember Joseph when he was taken into captivity into Egypt? How no matter where he worked, God was with him, and God raised him up to very important positions wherever he went. Well, the same is going on here. See, our God can do that. Our God is a lifter of persons. So he gained the blessings of God, and he reaped the confidence and favor of all those around him because of that. And when he interpreted a troubling dream later on for that hot-tempered king Nebuchadnezzar, he was promoted. Since he interpreted the dream, we'll read more about it as we go on, but he interpreted a dream for Nebuchadnezzar, the king. And Nebuchadnezzar was pleased with the fact that he was able to do it. So he was promoted to the position of authority over all the wise men in Babylon. Now he spent the rest of his life as one of the most powerful men in the world. One of the most powerful men in the entire world. He faithfully served several world leaders. And he's widely recognized as one of the greatest men of all times. So Daniel and his friend Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are found among the exiles. All these people were exiled, and these were young men that were taken out of it. And they were selected to serve the king in the king's palace. And they were all given Babylonian names. Hananiah becomes Shadrach. Mishael becomes Meshach Azariah. And Azariah becomes Abednego. And Daniel becomes Belshazzar. And so begins our experience in the book of Daniel. I'm sure you'll find it as interesting, and I'm going to do my best to keep it and make it interesting for you. So, until we get you again next week, just remember, I love you, and I want the God to make his face shine on you and to give you peace in all that you do. God bless you. See you next week.